Hello, and welcome to our listeners to the latest episode of the Sibylline Insight podcast. My name is Lewis Galvin. I'm the lead Americas Analyst here at Sibylline, and on today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the first 6 months of President Donald Trump's administration. Since his inauguration in January, Trump has introduced a raft of executive orders and legislation at a largely unprecedented rate, culminating in the recent passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. To help break this down and assess the implications, I'm joined by my colleagues from Sibylline's North America desk, Claire Brady and Azul Hidalgo Sola. Claire, if we could start with you, what have been the most recent updates coming out of the Trump administration, particularly those pertaining to the tax and spending bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act? And what does this mean for policy implementation for the Trump administration going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me here today. Just recently, on the 4th of July, President Donald Trump signed into law the Big Beautiful Bill, as it is called. And it's a huge package comprising mostly of sweeping tax and spending reforms. Now, our desk will soon be releasing a more in-depth report on this bill, but just to give some highlights right now, it cuts about $930 billion from Medicaid. It extends Trump's 2017 tax cuts. It raises the debt ceiling by $5 trillion and also allocates a significant amount of funding to defense and immigration enforcement measures. But what does this mean for Trump, as obviously this was a congressionally passed bill? For this administration, it was a huge win. Trump can now say he delivered on a number of his campaign promises, especially making those tax cuts permanent. But it really showed that Trump has the ability to sway the entire Republican Party in Congress, including those that were originally against some portions of this bill. And he can pressure party leadership to execute on his wishes. And now going forward in the next 6 months, we can expect that Trump will retain the same level of support in Congress, especially on new issues like passing the budget. For the rest of this podcast, we're going to be focused a bit more on what Trump can do from his position unilaterally and kind of without the need to consult Congress or pass legislation. But no matter, Trump can expect latent support from Congress on all of these topics that we are about to cover. And that means that he can spend more time on these issues like tariffs, like education policy, and spend less time on the Hill trying to wrangle the Republican Party together.
Thanks, Claire. I think that's a great breakdown of the bill and just where we're at in the current political landscape in the US. And in there, you mentioned one thing in particular, which is about Trump delivering on campaign promises. Of course, one of those that we're all aware of was attempting to boost domestic production and increase the US's standing and decrease reliance on global supply chains. I think this has largely been spearheaded by Trump's trade and tariff policy. So, Azul, could you bring us a little bit up to speed with what the latest developments have been on the tariff front and where we might be headed next?
Certainly, yeah, and thank you for having me. I think, the most important recent development in the tariff world took place on July 7th, when President Donald Trump signed an executive order extending the deadline for the 90-day reciprocal tariff suspension until August 1st, which was originally imposed in April and set to conclude on July 9th. As of right now, countries continue to face 10% tariffs, blanket tariffs, as well as a myriad of sector-specific tariffs that include aluminum and steel, auto parts, and as of July 9th, may also soon be facing tariffs on copper, on pharmaceuticals, and semiconductors, just to name a few. I think that the key or the crux here in these developments is twofold. For one, trade deals were not as easy to come by the administration as expected, especially as attention was pulled from foreign policy issues such as Iran. The administration thus far only has really secured deals with the UK in a very narrow scoped deal that the executive order has already been issued for. With China and with Vietnam, they've reached tentative and very fragile deals that are set to, be fragile to accusations of breaches or transshipment issues that have been brought up during the negotiation period. And they have signaled that they're close to deals with India, Pakistan, the EU, as well as escalated tensions to kind of get deals with Japan and South Korea across the line. However, these have fallen short of fulfilling the 90 deals and in 90-day promises that they had previously announced when the Liberation Day announcement was put forth. I think that the second angle here is that Trump will likely continue to use these tariffs as a punishment or coercive tool to reach favorable terms and influence international politics, that we've seen most recently with the 10% tariff threat on the BRICS countries. While, we will likely continue to see this in the coming months, I think it's important to note that the end goal here is that opening, it's opening that path to domestic investment and production, which you mentioned, which will be facilitated by a combination of these tariffs. An important caveat here is that where supply chains are deeply entrenched, so top of mind would be Canada and Mexico with autos, Chile with copper, Ireland with pharmaceuticals. The administration is likely to provide some exemptions or ease some restrictions. However, as supply chains begin to adjust long term, these might prove to be temporary reprieves. And I think, the bottom line here, and something that the administration has made clear with this tariff policy, is that, the deals are likely not going to be as comprehensive or permanent as expected. They're not going to reduce tariffs to 0%. And also, any retaliatory measures by countries will only serve to kind of hurt or escalate tensions, as we've seen with China and Canada in the past. And as you said, again, the protection of domestic industry is top of the agenda for the administration. So in the meantime, this tariff uncertainty will continue, and in the coming months as well. And this will continue to delay business decisions and sustain kind of those socioeconomic health risks that we've seen across sectors.
Thanks, Azul. Again, a fantastic breakdown of where we're at with the current tariff situation. And I heard in there you mentioned a couple of trading partners, so notably Canada and Mexico, and as well as the fact that tariffs are being used to influence bilateral and multilateral partnerships and negotiations. I think something that our investors might be keen on hearing about is the USMCA, so US-Mexico Canada agreement, which is up for renewal next year. So, Claire, when do we perceive negotiations are likely to begin, and what do we think Trump's demands might be?
Yeah, of course. So, like you said, the official primary joint review is set to start in July 2026. But that's a bit misleading. This is really more of a next 6 months short-term issue than that date would make it seem. Already in October, the U.S. Trade Representative is going to begin public consultations. And by January, he has to submit to Congress his recommendations for how to move forward with this agreement. And we know that Canada and Mexico have already started their consultation sessions, and both nations have signaled that ideally they would like to start formal speaking and negotiations before this July date, really, coming off of the last 6 months and the turmoil that these relationships have gone through. But we know that by the time, whenever formal negotiations do come around, if it's July 2026 or a bit earlier, we know that Trump is going to really treat this as a full renegotiation. It's not just a review like, the title might imply. And there's a couple key things that he will look to address, first of which is closing the so-called China loophole. And he will look to make sure that Chinese-made parts are not qualifying for USMCA exemptions, and this will likely include a push for tighter enforcement and tracking mechanisms. We can also expect that the U.S. delegation will be highlighting barriers in the Canadian and Mexican agriculture, banking, dairy, and telecom sectors, and push for more opportunities for U.S. firms to enter those markets. And finally, of course, very central to Trump's demands on Canada and Mexico, he will keep pushing for more border enforcement and efforts to combat illegal fentanyl and narcotics trafficking across both borders. So we know that is also going to stay very top of mind for these negotiations.
Thanks, Claire. And I think that's a great segue into, the next issue that we could look at, and that is, of course, immigration. So I'm keen to maybe look at this more from a domestic angle rather than the bilateral or multilateral angle. So, Azul, we know and we're hearing about a lot about mass deportation efforts. What is the outcome of these efforts so far? And can you just talk us through that?
Yeah, certainly. I think, since the inauguration of the administration in January, there's been a lot of reshuffling of the budget, of reorganizing, federal agencies that are in charge with immigration enforcement efforts to kind of focus the attention and the resources on assisting these efforts. As of the latest reports, the administration reached an average of 750 arrests or detentions per day, which is double the average of detentions over the past 10 years. So we've seen kind of this significant spike in these efforts that is corroborated by the amount of funds and attention that the issue has been getting lately. Most recently, the Trump administration's response to the anti-ICE demonstrations in Los Angeles, California, earlier in June, signaled that the administration will increase pressure on state governments to comply with this federal immigration agenda, especially kind of making an example of so-called sanctuary cities and sanctuary state policies, to pressure from many angles to have them, rolled back to assist in these federal efforts. This has been received with pushback from state governments and from federal judges who have placed injunctions or blocked a lot of threats that the administration has done over withholding funds for transportation issues, for extreme weather crisis response issues, to try and kind of detangle immigration from these other policy areas. However, this means that the pressure will highly likely continue to be sustained in the coming months and continue that friction going forward. I think this will sustain kind of domestic unrest risks that we've seen. And, the hotspots for these unrests include these sanctuary cities. So Chicago, Denver, Minneapolis, New York City, LA, just to name a few, that will be areas to look out for, in terms of, the coupling of issues, both the intersection of immigration as well as other kind of federal scrutiny, that these states have gotten from the administration. And I think thinking into longer term effects, there is kind of a socioeconomic health risk that we see increasing in the next couple of months, especially in the agriculture, construction, and hospitality sectors that employ large numbers of unauthorized immigrants and have already kind of expressed some risks of financial losses there. As well as, kind of public safety risks in communities that have large shares of unauthorized immigrants who, are no longer feeling safe, or the normalization of ICE efforts in a lot of public spaces will kind of deter them to cooperate with local law enforcement, which can bring issues in the longer term.
Thanks, Azul. And I think, yeah, you're right. This is an issue which certainly has far-reaching consequences and implications across a range of sectors, as you've rightly highlighted. Now, moving away a little bit just from deportation policy, but sticking with immigration. Claire, I'm sure our listeners are really keen to understand what the travel risks are now associated with the US, and particularly how this might have changed in recent years.
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue to touch on because the issue of deportations can seem, like it only impacts a certain group of people. But there are other changes to immigration policy that directly impact multinationals operating across the globe and really anyone looking to apply for a visa to the US or just travel to the country. So a recent measure that we saw Trump pass in early June was restricting travel for citizens of 12 countries, largely in Africa and the Middle East, because Trump claimed these regions were failing to cooperate with visa security protocols, and made up a high level of visa overstays. And he also claimed that these countries created terrorism risks. So that's just one example of, Trump using his executive authority to limit just simple travel to and from certain places. But we've also seen massive changes to the security vetting protocols for visas. So as recent as June 18th, the Trump administration resumed student visa appointments after they were paused for a while, but only after Secretary of State Marco Rubio ordered that diplomatic officers keep watch for applicants with a history of political activism, and also instructed more screening of social media accounts, and to consider these other risks that these applicants might bring into the U.S., which was not formally as taken into account or as focused on in this process. We've also seen reports that Border Patrol at both land crossings, at ports, and at airports have increased their frequency of device searches, which is within TSA and border security's power. But this is something that wasn't as much of a risk a couple years ago. But now it is advised that anyone traveling into the U.S., be ready to have their devices potentially screened at the border. And we are assessing that these risks are only going to continue in the coming months as Trump continues, his immigration policy overhaul, and looks to continue ramping up security at the border. So as I said before, really, firms that are conducting business in the U.S. or traveling into the U.S. really need to be aware that they are under a new level of scrutiny that they may not have faced before.
Thank you, Claire. And I noticed in there you mentioned travel risks that were particularly associated with student visas. And we know that education is another sector which has come under quite a lot of pressure from the administration. So, Azul, where are we currently at in the relationship between the federal government and universities? Are universities making deals with the admin, and will this scrutiny cease in the coming months?
Yeah, certainly. So perhaps the most vocal in making deals with the administration has been Harvard and Columbia. However, there hasn't been significant progress reported on those negotiations to restore federal funding or ease some of these, extra scrutiny that they've been facing from the administration. From the Harvard side, that has been tied to international students and blocking the ability to issue these visas that have created travel risks, as well as kind of financial loss risk for universities, as the international students make up a lot of the shares of sources of revenue in terms of tuition. From the Columbia side, the most recent conversations with the administration were surrounding kind of including a monitor within the structure to oversee Columbia's kind of different programs, as well as protest dynamics that they have in terms of campus activism. I think, increasingly the administration's disputes with the higher education sector have become part of a protracted debate that tries tries to balance the administration's grievances related to anti-discrimination laws, whether that is over alleged anti-Semitism on the 2024 pro-Palestine protests, or DEI policies, or, as well as balancing the academic institutions' concerns over academic integrity, independence, and freedom of speech. I think despite this, this heightened level of scrutiny has had ripple effects on propelling universities to preemptively roll back these policies, especially pertaining to DEI, campus protests, as well as kind of engaging in more debates related to trans athletes and in collegiate sports. And so, for the administration, universities have long been regarded as a left-leaning place in a hotbed of domestic unrest. So it is unlikely that federal scrutiny will be significantly decreased in the coming months. However, kind of the way that the negotiations with Harvard and Columbia pan out will be kind of a signaling for other universities to step in line and kind of address those concerns that the administration has in order to decrease these compliance risks.
Thanks, Azul. And I think that's a great way to cap off, a bit of a deep dive into a couple of specific areas, and really just highlighting how interconnected a lot of these issues are. But before we wrap up, Claire, I'm really interested to know, what is the relationship at the moment between the administration and the judiciary? We've heard a lot of challenges coming from the judiciary against administrative policies. And what implications is that likely to have on policy stagnation in the coming 6 months?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think what has really made the Trump administration's first 6 months so notable was the rate of executive orders that Trump was putting out, and how fast the administration was seeking to overhaul a number of agencies and policy areas. But in the face of all that, there have been just as many judicial challenges against all of these orders, and that's unlikely to go anywhere. So in these next 6 months, all of these changes and policies that we have just stated Trump is likely to do, it's equally as likely that still Democratic-led states and attorneys generals are going to, be submitting their own lawsuits against these policies. And, major organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, they are still going to be coming out against, these policies and try to hold them up any way they can in the courts specifically. And this is likely to only increase tensions between the executive branch and the judicial branch. We've seen Trump attack certain judges, calling them activist judges, saying that they're holding up, his mandate to lead that he was given by the American people. So as challenges continue to stagnate his policy goals, that tension is only likely to rise, and those attacks will continue.
Thanks, Claire. And just finally, what does this policy landscape signal for the lead up to the 2026 midterm elections?
Yeah, I think it's another issue that can kind of seem long term, but really lawmakers are going to be turning their attention to the midterm elections within the next 6 months, really by the autumn period. And so, what Trump does in these next 6 months, and also how the economy reacts to these changes, is really going to directly set up the campaign period that we see at the beginning of 2026. So Trump's actions will determine, what issues get focused on, what Democrats use to attack, and also, what some Republicans might need to distance themselves from, or, some might choose to get closer to Trump. Some might, again, try to distance themselves, because it's important to remember that, Trump is not the one up for election here, and neither is anyone in his administration. It is lawmakers, and particularly some Republicans in some very competitive districts and states. They're going to have to be the ones, potentially held accountable for what voters like or don't like about the Trump administration so far, and what he does in the next 6 months.
Okay, so thank you so much, Claire and Azul, for joining me today to deep dive into what is a pretty complex and interconnected set of issues. So I really appreciate your support, and I'm sure our listeners will really appreciate you joining me as well. To our listeners, I'd like to direct you to our WRR reporting subscription, where you can keep up to date with all of the hard work that the analysts on the North America desk are doing. One of these products includes our US policy review, where we're keeping on top of a raft of legislative changes and developments coming out of the US on a weekly basis. To access a free trial to the WRR subscription, please contact info@sibylline.co.uk. And otherwise, we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Sibylline Insight podcast. Thank you.